Scary recording voice. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to History Matters, and so does coffee. Today, as advertised, we're going to be talking about masculinity, which is getting, I don't want to say press. People are talking about it a lot. So that's what I wanted to discuss, take a look at it in history. And I think that's going to shed some light on what we're seeing right now. But before I do that, I shall turn to Grace, who will explain to us the rules of the game.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Grace Leatherman. I'm the Executive Director of the National Council for History Education. We are delighted that you were with us this morning. And Joanne, thank you again for being with us to use the lens of history to help explain our times. We'd love it if you participate, so make sure you participate in the chat. And if you have questions for Joanne, please put them in the Q&A so that I can see them. I want to make sure I ask all your questions. If you enjoy this, you'll probably enjoy the rest of our programming. We have lots of things available at ncheteach.org, ncheteach.org. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand things back to you, Joanne. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so, oops. Okay, better. Okay, so as I said, I wanted to talk about masculinity because it appears to be everywhere right now. I didn't get a chance to look up what Tucker Carlson is advertising with his sort of manly men video that people were talking about, with men standing naked, whatever it is, I don't know, but it's clearly about manliness. And as someone who writes about honor culture, men choosing violence when engaged in politics, I have always been interested in this whole issue since grad school and beyond, about masculinity and what it is and what it does and why at certain moments it flares up. The demands for it certainly flare up, and it takes a more prominent place in politics and culture. And there's been a lot of this sort of rhetoric floating around. I actually wrote something down here, and I think I'm not going to say it because it's actually rather upsetting. So that tells you a little bit about, I'm also going to say, I'm not necessarily talking about toxic masculinity, which is a kind of masculinity. What I do want to talk about is just the role that masculinity has served in, really more than anything else, society and politics. And why at particular moments seems to take on more important. Now, a couple things I'll say at the outset. This will be a broad sweeping statement, but to some degree, masculinity is an invention. And the reason I say that is not for some theoretical highfalutin reason, but if you think about it, different cultures all have a very different definition of masculinity, right? There is no one definition of masculinity. There's no one definition of masculinity in the United States. So to some degree, a people decide what equals masculine in their society. In the United States, there has not ever been one ideal. There have been some that I suppose stood up more loudly than others is a really bad mixed metaphor, who showed more prominently in our culture than others, and I guess John Wayne is one, and I guess the Marlboro Man, the big billboard, as these sort of manly men who work in movies and in advertising because they communicate something powerful. And I'll talk a little bit when I'm talking about masculinity and American history today about some of the different styles. Not surprisingly, you will not be surprised at all to hear that there's Northern and Southern modes of masculinity, certainly in the 19th century. But I do want to talk a little bit about the sort of long view of masculinity, starting out with leadership and then just talking about more broadly hierarchy, politics, control. And I will leave those words floating there. Generally speaking as a political historian, when you look at American politics and you go back to the 1790s, as I so frequently do, you see that even then, people were pretty explicitly wanting some kind of proof of masculinity when they were looking particularly for presidential candidates. Now, of course, they didn't have to look very far for Washington. John Adams John Adams actually, at one point, went to give some kind of a congressional address and wore a sword. I guess he was like, I'm the commander in chief, and apparently didn't play well, which is particularly why we know we know about it. But he was, military experience at the time, not surprisingly, and still, I suppose, is to many an absolute symbol and actually proof that you are manly, that you are masculine, that you are the sort of person who can lead. And you can see that when you look at some of the campaign rhetoric and even just correspondence between people leading up to the election of 1800 that ultimately elects Jefferson. There are people behind the scenes who are concerned because he had no military experience. Like, uh-oh, can you have a president without military experience? What does that mean? And playing up the fact that, other candidates do have military experience, and that means something because they've proven themselves in battle in some way, and that's proof of manhood, proof of masculinity. That's, in a sense, the logic behind dueling as well, right? So it's always counterintuitive to say that dueling is not about killing, even though you would assume that two men standing in a field shooting at each other might be trying to kill each other. But really what dueling is about is proving that you are willing to die for your honor and reputation. So it's more about standing and facing the other gun than it is about killing somebody. That's the logic behind it. And after a duel, assuming you don't get shot and die, you have really proven your manhood because you looked death in the face and it all ended up okay. That's the logic behind dueling. You prove your reputation and your manhood by literally facing fire. So there's always been an assumption in American history that military experience is good, that masculinity and manhood is something that you need, particularly in high leaders. But as I said before, there has never been one absolute model. And you can see this most particularly, actually, this is part of what interested me in writing my last book, Lurking Over My Shoulder. I didn't initially set out and think to myself, this shall be an interesting way to test modes of masculinity. I wanted to understand North and South and West, when you put them in one room and you set them to work dealing with really contentious, controversial topics, and they had different understandings of violence and law and justice, what happens? So in the end, what happens is the Northerners become more violent and they kind of sink down to the level of what Southerners were doing, which was more openly violent, more aggressive. And that tells you something, again, about masculinity and manhood. That and I always hesitate to make big, broad generalizations about models of manhood or what manhood is, because they, by definition, cloud over so much subtlety, and it's to some degree, although this won't make sense, there's a lot of subtlety involved in playing the part. However, all of that said, I will say that there was a more sort of dignified man watching over his family, kind of restrained, hardworking Northern mode of manhood and masculinity, and the Southern mode, not surprisingly, was more centered on the individual mode, at least, was more centered on violence. And of course, that has to have something to do with the fact that they are in a literal culture of mastery, meant in the actual sense of the word, right? If you're in a slave regime and your livelihood and your family and your life and your sense of honor, I suppose, rests on a cruel and violent institution, your idea of manhood is going to be bound up with that. So it's not surprising that the Southern mode of manhood was more violent than the Northern mode, or that Southerners deployed that and made use of that, often by threatening duels, but in a variety of different ways. They were, for a long time, more likely to be armed in Congress. They flaunted their weapons, they flaunted their willingness to fight, and some Northerners would sit down or refuse to stand up and would not assert themselves for fear of not necessarily being attacked, but for the humiliation. It's back to manhood, masculinity. If they stood up and were confronted that way and didn't meet that challenge, they would be humiliated. Their manhood would be crushed in some way or another was their assumption. So it had a real power in Congress. And you can see even in Southern electoral contests, there's one case in which my most frequent fighter, who's Virginian Henry Wise, he pushes someone on I think they're both on horses and they're at a horse race or something. I can't even remember all the details, but he shoves him. So it's a physical confrontation. It's not very violent, but it's a shove. And this other fellow whose name has left my mind, maybe Stanley. I didn't look this up before doing this, but I think his name is Stanley, doesn't respond, doesn't challenge him to a duel. He just doesn't respond. And when I was in North Carolina doing research, I found campaign flyers that were mocking him for being weak and feminine, for not standing up when he was shoved. So it was like right there in print. Oh, like what kind of carrot are you? I think it was, they had made some little rhyme about that he was a coward and would run, running was somehow, he was the guy who runs away, he's a coward. So this kind of stuff had play. It had electoral play, and it had play even just on the floor of a legislature. A striking example of this, and it was one of the early things that jumped into my mind when I was thinking about this topic. It's not necessarily what I focused on when I wrote about it, but the same book starts out with this statement, a sort of affidavit of sorts that 3 congressmen sign, attesting to what it felt like to be in Congress and fight slavery in the 1850s. And there's a little throwaway line in there. So most of their statement is about Southerners confronting them and insulting them, and they cry out and say in the letter that their manhood was being assaulted on a daily basis, right? So they're experiencing this as an attack on their manhood because they don't feel that they can respond. They also experience it as an attack on their manhood because they were not properly representing their constituents if they were backing down. And so that was another attack on their manhood. But the statement that I didn't necessarily write about was when in that statement, when they're describing what it felt like in the 1850s, they start out by saying, the Southerners were being horrible to us, and our leader, William Seward, wasn't doing anything. And I can't even remember the phrase, but it's sort of like, whether there was some strategy to that or whether he lacked manhood, he wasn't responding. Think about that, right? That was, and in that moment, in that culture, with those men in this particular situation, you can understand why they said, our manhood is suffering, and you're our leader, and you're just sitting there, like maybe you're not a man enough for the situation. So this kind of talk and all of the assumptions that go along with it have a really big, strong, maybe not strong, somewhat vulnerable. I'll come back to that in a moment. History, as far as leadership, as far as power, as far as what impresses people in a political electoral environment. I'll also say, actually, I didn't mean to skip over him. How could I skip over Andrew Jackson? That's another obvious example, and it's no surprise that during the Trump administration, Jackson was being hearkened back to as some kind of a model. Jackson, is someone who is famed and proudly proclaimed the fact that he was a duelist, not only that, but a duelist who killed his man. And he had a very kind of hierarchical sense of manhood and what men are supposed to do. There's scholarship floating around out there about what he was teaching these male relatives who were staying with him about how to be a man. He was very much in the model of, being sort of rough and tough and willing to fight and physically standing up for what you believe in. He had a very particular kind of Western tinged model of manhood. Now, here's the part that's worth considering. Look over the long view of American history, and there are times when cries out for masculinity or statements about it or cultural focus on it, I don't want to say are at an extreme, but are more powerful, are louder and seem more prevalent than at other times. One of those times, actually, is around the same time that Jackson comes into power, Andrew Jackson. Why? Well, in part, he's a very hierarchical guy. He wants society to be in a certain kind of order, right? He says he's the president for the common man, obviously the common white man. That's, he's uniting white men around him as his way to come to power. But that time, the 1820s, the 1830s, that's a moment when urbanization and industrialization are mixing up society, are changing hierarchies, are breaking down traditional family structures. You have single people, single men and women going into cities or working at mills or at a variety of different industrial, factories of sorts that are rising up in this period, so that traditional hierarchies that you once could take for granted could not be taken for granted in the same way. And it would have felt like a period in flux. And if you were someone who really needed and wanted to have that sense of stability where you were unquestionably in power, that would have been a moment when you felt threatened. And that would be a handy moment to start talking about, focusing on, and demonstrating masculinity, manhood. In essence, by doing that, you are standing up and saying, like, this is what a man is. And in saying that, you're probably also saying, and this is what a woman is, not the same as a man. You're making a declaration of power and hierarchy when you are really focused on talking about categorizing things that count as manhood, things that count as manly or as masculinity. So in that era with Jackson, that kind of a stance was particularly popular because society was being upset in some ways by industrialization and by urbanization. Okay, so now let's move on a little bit in time. Let's move on to the 1960s. The 1960s, a moment when you have, and this is just a list and not inclusive by any means, the civil rights movement, the rise of feminism, the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. You have, in a variety of different ways, and in the 1960s, in a sometimes flamboyant way, destabilization of the social order. Things that you took for granted about who had a voice and who didn't, about who got to express that voice, about how loud those voices were, about the rights that people were demanding, about the way that it seemed as though there might actually be substantial change. That was a moment when it would have felt as though the social order was being destabilized, and people who had a traditional view of society and wanted hierarchies in play and didn't like that suggestion of change and felt threatened and felt that in some way or another their hold on power was being threatened, they took this as an attack on what America is, right? America is X, and I am at the top of the hierarchy in America, and whatever they're doing now that makes me feel like I'm under attack is attacking America. You can see the train of logic. And so it's in the wake of the 1960s that you begin to get sort of extreme, like male drumming societies of men who go out to the woods and they pound drums because they're being manly. You get a focus on manhood, masculinity, how important it is. That's partly a response to feminism. And 1,000 years ago in grad school, I actually wrote about that. But the larger idea of focusing on the importance of manhood, that's partly a response to what was happening in the 1960s. And you don't have to sympathize with it, but you can understand why someone with a very traditional view of what society should be and shouldn't be, and who should have power and who shouldn't have power, very explicitly, who shouldn't have power. And obviously in this kind of idea of manhood, the race implication here is always that white men should be at the top of the hierarchy. And so there's always a racial component in addition to a gender component. But regardless, things feel unstable, society feels disordered. That is taken to mean an attack on what the United States stands for, because you have always assumed that this is what the United States is. This is the kind of power I have. I'm one of the people who should have power. If I feel discomfited and I feel that I'm losing my power, well, that's an attack on America. That's the trail of logic that these people take. So switching for a moment then back to the present, It's not going to be surprising in some ways what I'm going to get to now, but I'll get to it anyway. First off, I want to make the point that despite there's hyper presence right now of talk about masculinity and maleness and it getting really deliberately played up in the press and culturally on the right, this is not new. So this is not, you should not look at what's going on now and say, this is all Donald Trump, right? This is all a product of the now. Speaking as a historian, it isn't. However, you can say that Donald Trump stylized it and encouraged it in some way, and that he being present is in some ways a response to people feeling that the social order is changing, that it's upset that people who assumed they would always have power may not always have power. You know, and if you think about it, it won't be hard to remember his stance as a candidate for president. You know, he was deliberately uncivil. He was a bully during debates. We will never forget, I'm sure, his looming over Hillary Clinton physically as he did, that weirdness, excuse me, during one debate. He was unrestrained and aggressive. He looked strong, and people liked that. They still do, right? They still, it's even hard to exaggerate it, the degree to which there are paintings out there of like him, you know, transposed into the frontier on a horse or whatever. He's always being sort of depicted as the manly man, right? And that's part of why he's great. He's strong and he doesn't really care about what anyone thinks about him or about the rules. That has an appeal right now. And the appeal of that is in line with everything that I've just said. We are at a moment, and it's not the fault of the presidency of Barack Obama, but that helped, when people who have traditionally been in power, white men of certain means, feel that things they have taken for granted, the assumed order of things, the assumptions with which they can maintain power, and now it's not just men, it's broader than that to some degree, because this is also a Christian evangelical, it kind of goes into that as well. If you're an evangelical of certain sort and you're standing up for you know, traditional values, again, you're looking back to this time when men were men and women were women and everyone knew where they should be. We're at this moment when there's one candidate who played that card very well and encouraged it in some way. And what we're seeing now is people grabbing at that as a tool and a weapon at a time, and now making it into an ad campaign at a time when they feel threatened, as though things are changing and they may not be in control. And that's not democracy. That's not politics. That's an attack on the American social order. Now, of course, democracy and politics is about power continually being moved back and forth and changed, and the, you know, the winds of power, the breezes of power moving, and one group having it and another group not having it, and it's supposed to reflect American society. That's how democracy is supposed to work. So if you're standing up and saying, I sense change and it has to be bad because I might not have power in it, that's not the most democratic message that you can be sending. So this is the moment that we're in which there's this linking together of changes in the social order, people getting rights and voices in a way that they did not necessarily have before, more Americans than before agreeing with and endorsing that kind of change. We forget that because some of the loudest people on this issue happen to be on the right, but the left at the moment remains the numerical majority. But what we're seeing is people who are afraid of losing what they have assumed was always there and what they feel that they deserve, seeing that as an attack on America, an attack on what America should be, and responding often in an extreme kind of a way with this manhood, you know, attack. And unfortunately, this is not true for all assumptions about masculinity and manhood, but violence can be right in the mix, right? That if you have to fight for what's right, sometimes you have to fight. You can see the bundle of social and political assumptions that get woven together in a moment like the present. in a moment like the 1960s, other moments in the past, the 1820s, 1830s, when this masculinity manhood focus was a response to feeling that things were changing. So oddly enough, and really counterintuitively, while it looks like and feels like to us that all of this focus on manhood is an assertion of strength, it's actually an expression of vulnerability. It happens when people feel vulnerable to change. Now, that's, if I were listening to this, I might be thinking, well, that's easy for you to say, Freeman, like, it's a sign of vulnerability, but I'm still being silenced, shoved to the side, stepped on, and everything else. And that's true. But along the line, I'm going to say contingency now. I just said it, I'm going to say it again. If you are thinking about where we are in the present moment and are looking at certain people, some of them, a lot of them on the right, claiming like, that's it, we won, we've taken over, it's all ours, we win, and asserting their masculinity as proof that they've done it and as the tool with which they did it. What I'm talking about today, and the reason I chose to talk about it today, is that it's important to remember that what you're seeing, that's not a display of strength. That's a display of fear and vulnerability. I mention that and I tie that in with contingency because I've said a few hundred zillion times, I know, and I'll say it again, that right now we are at a moment of extreme contingency, intense possible change, and we don't know what's going to happen. And nothing has been absolutely concluded as, oh, we're done, it's a given. It's a moment when what we do and what we think matters profoundly, particularly in the realm of society and democracy writ broadly, as far as society goes and politics as well. It matters. And so I think it's an important message to get out now at this particular moment that don't look at all of the chest pounding, oh, we're so strong, and cower behind it with the assumption being, wow, they've really taken over. That's not what that shows. That shows people who feel desperately the need to maintain a hold. And that should, those of you who have a different view of society, that should be cheering to you that change is possible, that that's perceived on all sides, and that matters. So, as a historian who's interested in political culture, masculinity is always fascinating to me because this will sound understated, it leads people to do things that make no sense, right? When I studied dueling, I got into masculinity because I thought, what in the heck is going to get two men to go out on a field and shoot at each other? How does that make sense, right? And just settle an argument? And it had to do with manhood, reputation, masculinity, and the fact that those were like actual possessions that you could lose and you would risk your life to keep. So I'm always interested in the cultural component of it, but the place it serves, the role it has in politics and in democracy or the suppression of democracy, it always is, well, not always, I'll take that back. Historians never say always, first, unique, but it often is bound up with people who are afraid that a more traditional social order is being threatened. And so traditional manhood needs to come to the fore and save the day. Okay, I'm a few minutes past, but I will stop there. Oh, and I did not see the mug. Oh, I beat it. Okay, so let's get this out of here. I had to think on this one. What's a masculinity? I was actually getting ready for this and I was primpifying and I was like, what's a masculinity mug? Do I have a masculinity mug? And I do. It's the 18th century soldier mug. So I kind of did. I'm not going to be able to tell you the details because they're on the bottom. But there you go. It's a guy, if you can't see, I think he has it on this side too. Oh no, okay, wait a minute. On this side, he's armed with a sword. So I got to show you the right side, right? Man with sword on horse. Manly man. So this is indeed my masculinity mug. So Grace, I do not see Grace, and I do not know if, oh, there you are, if you have a background, if you chose a background, but if you do, now is the moment to explain it.
Well, I just went off your title of Macho Rodeo Politics. So I thought I chose not to go with the horse, but with the spectators, because sometimes, we're all just watching. So
Excellent.
these are, I believe this is 1939 in Montana. So this is a crowd watching a rodeo.
That and rodeo is good, and that was what I forgot to put in my notes, and I forgot to say it, right? Macho rodeo politics. So I don't know where that came up with. It was from a tweet, and I was like, oh, come on, like, I'm so tired of this macho rodeo politics. I think it was like in response to someone else tweeting like, you got to go get them, if you need to, you got to shoot them. And I said, not only is that a threat, but I also said, I'm so tired of the macho rodeo politics. It just came out, and then I thought, oh, that really kind of captures what I think. So that was where the title for this episode came from, is that I think macho rodeo politics kind of sums up a certain something about the moment that we're in. So we're all tired of I'm going to open, now I could get to open the chat because I won't get distracted.
Yep.
But now.
All right. So we do have lots of questions coming in if you're ready for them.
I am ready.
And these are very interesting. I mean, people are really thinking hard about this, particularly historically, which is great. Do continue to put your questions in the Q&A. So there's a number of questions about Jefferson here. I think Cece mentions him. Gloria mentions him also. So Jefferson does not have military experience. So how does he make up for that? Is there a sort of non-military masculinity he could reach for, or did people just not think he was that masculine?
No, that's a good question. Well, so, and there's a mixed answer. So on the one hand, I would say, if you're proving yourself worthy of being a leader, military experience was big, but so was proven service in your community in one way or another, political service in your community as a leader. So would having a family that went back in time in an area so that your family has proven that it can be trusted. So masculinity, military experience alone didn't necessarily make up leadership material. You could have a blend of things. But for Jefferson, not only did he not have military experience, but he was accused of, when he was governor of Virginia and the British were coming to Virginia, leaving, right? So he was charged not only with no military experience, but cowardice. And the reason why that floated around during that, in the late 1790s, when he was vice president and then president, is for this very issue, right? That means he's not a leader. Now, what that also tells you is that might have been important, but not important enough to keep him from becoming vice president and president. So it's important. It's a good question because it's important to remember that it's a blend of things that would make you feel as though you were suitable for leadership. Your roots, having known roots, a family that people could track, or your presence somewhere for a long time, would have been part of it, which is where you come up with, and I don't know if I've talked about this before. You can tell me if I have. It's just one of my favorite 18th century phrases. If you were someone who didn't have deeply planted roots in a community, and you were out there trying to be a leader, or socially a leader, or politically a leader, you might be called a mushroom gentleman. And what that meant was someone who sprouts up in the dark with no roots, right? Just like out there, comes up in the shadows, has no roots, and suddenly appears. Like a mushroom gentleman is someone you do not trust. Hamilton would have been deemed a mushroom gentleman, right? He kind of appears out of nowhere. He's really ambitious. Where are his roots? We don't know anything about his roots. So that idea also is a reminder of it's a blend of things that might make you qualified as a leader. Military experience was just a big one, but not the only one.
Interesting. Thank you. And again, so Gloria talks about him too. And Gloria is, she says that Gordon Wood felt that Republican theory was feminine rather than the more masculine views at the time. And she gives the example of the Oath of Rodeo, the painting, as exemplifying masculinity as opposed to Republican ideals. Was there that thought of different political ideas as being masculine or feminine?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think, so I'll have a two-part answer because I'm a historian. On the one hand, I wouldn't say that people at the moment were saying republicanism is emasculating, I guess, not demasculating, or feminine in some ways. I don't think that was necessarily in the wind. On the other hand, republicanism relies on ideas about virtue and morality.
Mhm.
So for a republic to survive, right, a monarchy survives based on a monarch. A republic survives based on people elected into office by the people, and the people need to be virtuous enough and educated enough to pick leaders that deserve responsibility. So republicanism is community minded, is virtue and morality minded. So you could certainly look at that and say there's a component of it that is feminine, and it also gave women a symbolic and sometimes real kind of power, right? Because their job, this is the Republican mother or the Republican wife, their job was to help create virtuous, strong young men and right-minded young women to be good small r Republicans in the future. So I guess I'm half agreeing that you could look at it and say that because of the ways in which it's grounded on things that traditionally are not seen as masculine, and competitive democracy, right, where you're out there, and not just politically, but democracy is about competing, you have contests, and you win and you lose, and that's a rougher kind of a game, which is not to say there wasn't a rough game in the earlier period, because I write about it. But by definition, there's that edge to republicanism that is community minded and morality minded, and that affects the nature of it.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So I am with Dale in that we both know who we're talking about, but we can't recall this gentleman's name. You have talked about a particularly, Dale says, a large fellow willing to challenge the Southerners, who tended to make the Southerners look ridiculous. We've heard you mention him a number of times. We're both blanking on the name.
Joshua Giddings?
I think, yes. Would he have been an example of what Northerners wanted to project as manly?
Oh, interesting. At that point in time, he was not necessarily a model.
Mhm.
And his diary talks about, because you had to be extra bonus, sort of brave and aggressive to be a Joshua Giddings. Joshua Giddings of Ohio, just to fill folks in, was in Congress, was an ardent abolitionist, and would stand up and give these very assertive, strong anti-slavery speeches, and doing that in Congress with armed Southerners who did not like that and wanted to silence you, that took guts. And he was attacked, I believe, 7 times in his congressional career that a Southerner attacked him for speaking that way. And he liked that. That was his nature, right? He liked it. He, at one point, maybe in his diary, maybe in a letter to his wife, he calls baiting Southerners good sport, right? So he knows what he's doing. In my book, I call him an anti-slavery toreador, because what he does is he stands up and says something deliberately provocative, and there's always some Southerner who runs at him with a cane, and then Giddings basically says, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the South. They sort of humiliate themselves by proving themselves these howling people. So he was someone who people admired for what he did, but I don't think people assumed they could do that too. He was a big guy. And it suited him, that kind of combat. He says in his diary, when he first gets to Congress, that he's surprised that the Northern members of Congress just won't stand up to the Southerners. They just won't do it. And I think he talks about a moment when there's a Southern member of Congress who is claiming he wants to be reimbursed for a per diem having to do with some travel that actually had nothing to do with Congress. He's just like, basically, I want money, right? And it has nothing to do with anything. He's just lying. And in his diary, Giddings says, he's not due that money. And these Northerners here with me, like, they know he's not due that money, but he's a dueling man, and they're not going to stand up and say that. So this is all the sort of stuff that I got so interested in writing that book. It shapes, in a concrete way, it shapes politics. Mm-hmm. But Giddings is a great example of a certain kind of manhood. And, this book by Kelly Carter Jackson called Force and Freedom, there are white models. There are white models of nonviolence, right? There are white models of like using the legal system to change slavery. And then there are white models of people willing to be violent. And there are Black models of both as well. And her book is, I recommend it highly, really fascinating, Force and Freedom. And I know someone out there is going to go find it and stick up a link, but it deals in a really interesting way with ways of incorporating violence into attacks on slavery.
Yeah, definitely check out that book. And she's got some speeches online too. It's very, very interesting stuff. All right. Again, all kinds of good questions here. All right, Miranda wants to know a little bit more about James Buchanan. And I have to admit, his hometown is fairly near mine, but I don't
Okay.
know much about James Buchanan. Um, yeah, and she seems to think that people did not think he was manly at the time. And how did he get elected? She wants to know. And just your thoughts on James Buchanan and masculinity.
Right. No, well, that's a good point. It gets back to my other point about there's other things that might get you elected.
Yeah,
But yes, people did not think he was masculine. I believe they called him Miss Nancy.
yeah.
Um,
She wanted. Yeah, I don't know much about James Buchanan.
and
I didn't know he was perhaps thought to be gay.
well, I was going to say,
Mhm,
there are many who would say that he's gay.
mhm.
He had a long-term relationship with a man. Um, someone else is going to get gender. So in my podcast, Heather and I talked about this. We talked about gender in the past, and we talked about how what we now state, people now state assertively that there's manhood and there's womanhood, and it's very traditional and it's very clear what the definition is. And part of what we show in the episode of the podcast is that no, actually tradition, the long past over a pretty long period of time, was that there weren't set standards and there weren't dividing lines, and there was more fluidity about who people were and how you branded them or defined them, and the categories people even had in their minds for branding people. So Buchanan was at a more fluid time. So first of all, it wouldn't be like now where people would point a finger and say, you know, you're a gay man and should not be a leader. Certainly, he's being called Miss Nancy. People at the time are questioning his manhood and his masculinity. But he also was someone, you know, who had political connections, who had a political career. So he wasn't just running on manhood and masculinity. And not everybody thought he was a Miss Nancy, which is a sort of way at the time to accuse somebody of being what we now say is gay.
Mhm. Interesting. Thank you.
Triple bingo. I don't know how I got it.
Oh
In.
my
Oh, I
goodness,
said
triple bingo.
podcast. That's got to have helped somehow. Yeah.
Dale wants to know, does the evolution of the idea of masculinity in our early history affect which men were elected to public office? I mean, you've sort of been touching on this, especially the president.
Um, I mean, I guess I would say yes, but in a, maybe subtle's not the right word, complicated way, right? I mean, there are assumptions at different periods of time of what a man is. And as I said a moment ago, there's some fluidity to that in a way that now we try to categorize people and make them check boxes. That said, it would be possible to stray beyond a certain point and people would see you as somehow not right. And you might not be able to run for office, but you know, I don't think I think the fluidity is the point, right? Is that the people weren't checking boxes yet. They were, you know, and they also sometimes were masking behaviors, were denying things, were afraid of being attacked in some way for their what they preferred, who they preferred to be with, and why. So I'm not saying, and Heather and I were careful to say this in the episode, we're not saying like, the wonderful past, when it was so easy to have different views on gender. That's not what we're saying at all. For in ways that ended up being good and bad, there was just more fluidity. And so it could be, on the one hand, easier to attack somebody because you decide they are what they are and you're not checking boxes. But there was a more fluid definition.
Mhm. Interesting. We've got a fascinating question from Clinton here. Clinton,
Okay.
I don't know if I just think this is a brilliant question. How strong is the correlation between masculinity and the ability to survive in whatever was the contemporary wilderness area? So I'm thinking, so we got like Andrew Jackson, so that's like frontier, right? And then later on, you've got the model of the cowboy. So is that in fact sort of a theme here in how we define masculinity?
Well, there is, I mean, I like a couple things about that question. On the one hand, I like the fact that it's a reminder that, you know, people tend to look at American history generally and even the 19th century, and divided into North and South because they're thinking about the Civil War, when it was North, South, and West.
Yeah.
And they were assumed to be three sections of the Union. And I think I've said before here in one way or another, how, like, I've seen directories talking about, listing names of people in different jobs in the government, so government directories, and they would list the name of someone from some Western state, and it would say Southern born or Northern born. So in other words, they were still tracking, they still assumed North and South made a huge difference about your views about certain things, particularly slavery, but there was a Western version that was rougher. That Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, that kind of model that played well. The public liked it. Sometimes they played that up. Those sorts of men. There's books that sold wildly with that sort of Davy Crockett, on the frontier, Daniel Boone, that these were men who wrestled bears, and there was a Western version of it. It was rougher. There's an article, and I always get the title wrong, but there's a good reason, by Elliot Gorn, and it's titled something like push, fight, shove, gouge, stab. It just has like a string of words. But what it's about is the equivalent of the honor culture that I write about in the North and South. In the West, there was a really rough version of it, which included eye gouging and some really ugly stuff. People who traveled in the West would comment that sometimes you would see people with one eye more often than you might think you would in your normal everyday life. That was, oddly enough, honor culture, right? That was people proving their manhood in a contest against somebody else. That's just, violence is a more incorporated part, and that sort of model of manhood is just a more normalized way of behaving in the frontier, sometimes for frontier purposes. It's a good question.
We learned about Kentucky eye gouging in graduate school, and it was not something I had encountered up to that point. And I just thought, there's so much about America I don't know.
Eye gouging. If you're curious about that, it's an older article. I want to say maybe it's from the 70s or 80s. But you can look up Elliot Gorn, and it's probably, because it's old enough, it might be online in databases and such, but it's really interesting, and it talks about this in detail.
Interesting. So we have on the other hand, so we just asked about how the frontier defines masculinity. But I think Jean, I think it's Mrs. Hobbs, is that right? When we asked what she should be called, that's what she actually said. How does the cultured gentleman fit into the accepted role of masculinity, the clothing, education, elite society? So you've got, on the other hand, are there other ways of defining masculinity, and how does that work? How can you?
There were, which gets back to, on the one hand, the idea that it's invented, and that different cultures and different countries and different regions have different ideas about it. So yeah, there was a sort of dignified, educated, family man version of manhood. It wasn't only in the North, but there was a lot of it in the North. And there was a more, sort of manly man fighting for his family and doing what it takes kind of version of it that tended to be more Southern. But they would have been both acceptable depending on what part of the Union you were in. So if you're one of these, educated, wearing a certain kind of clothing and behaving in a certain kind of a way person, and you went into the deep South, and if were extreme in your behavior along those lines, you might not necessarily get mocked, but people would notice. Let's put it that way. You might not seem quite manly enough. So there are a lot of variations of manhood floating around, and they're somewhat sectional for this chunk of time. So I don't want to make these like Northerners were distinguished and educated, and Southerners were crazy and violent. It's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But there were all kinds of variants. And to understand the politics of the time, particularly because politics is responding to society, you have to understand this part of American society and culture. You have to understand versions of masculinity, how that shaped male behavior, which thus would have, and female behavior actually, which thus shaped politics in some pretty direct ways. It's part of what I always argue in my work is, as a political historian, it makes perfect sense that you're studying voting patterns, and you're studying legislation, and you're studying political parties, and you're studying a lot of the things we assume and take for granted are political history. Some of what I argue in my work is actually these more nebulous things, emotion and masculinity. Those are things that have a profound profound impact on politics. So to really understand politics, you have to delve into that kind of stuff too. And I'm not saying I'm the only one or the first one who has, but I think sometimes that gets overlooked.
All right. Well, and another interesting question from Dale. Now, of course, much of your research has focused on men in politics who are necessarily white, given their time periods. But Dale is wondering about Black models of masculinity. He wonders, I think, thinking more about this idea of the frontier. Did Buffalo Soldiers have an influence on both free and enslaved African Americans during their heyday?
Well, I think once again, two things. I think there would have been Black models of masculinity for sure. But that always had to be framed in a certain way or expressed in a certain way, because depending on who you were, if you were enslaved or free, for example, you may or may not feel free to express yourself in a certain way. So it's a complicated question. If you're talking about Black people in America while slavery was still in effect, because it affected what you could or couldn't do. It determined you couldn't seem to have a kind of power or look to get a certain kind of power. So I haven't written on this or worked on this, but the idea that particularly enslaved men had a version of manhood that made sense in that environment makes perfect sense. And since there were so many ways in which enslaved people found ways to assert power and authority that sometimes white folk just didn't see, but that had a big impact among other Black people, not necessarily enslaved, this would fit into that category. I'm sure there's work on it that I just don't know about, but it's a great question and an important reminder.
Yeah, I think that it is a great reminder, and there again probably there are so many ways to define masculinity, as we've said. Someone pointed out that when you talk about the cultured gentleman, that's sort of almost more of a British model, perhaps. And I'm just thinking that in addition to there may be differences between Black and white versions of masculinity in the time periods you studied. Are there any other differences? I don't know, in different cultures. There's certainly pockets around the country from different countries, and so again, is there that variety that you see? Because
you're saying, is there more variety in the United States, or I'm not sure I follow the question.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm just thinking when we talk about this, we've been talking a lot about folks who are in power politically. So we're talking mostly from English extraction. We're talking mostly white. So we just mentioned that we have to think about what Black masculinity might have looked like.
Right.
And I'm thinking there are going to be communities from other countries. There are going to be Germans in Pennsylvania. There are going to be Moravians in North Carolina. So I'm just wondering if some of that influence from other countries is going to mean that there's variation throughout the country.
For sure. Oh, for sure. First of all, it will mean in pockets where people of one particular ethnicity or country or whatever settle, right? And there are communities everywhere, everyone, wherever you are, beaming in from here in chat, knows of, what sometimes a city will call Chinatown, but areas where there happen to be a lot of people from Poland, or there happen to be a lot of people from wherever. And in those areas, there will be other cultural components that have a power that they might not have in other areas. What's interesting to me about that, and again, this is not something I've ever studied, but my personal experience of this is sometimes the power to not conform with what's outside and to stay really in the models of what's going on that are inside your own community can be really powerful, even with everything going on around you. And I mention that because my step grandmother, so my mother's whole side of the family is Hungarian, and my step grandmother's mother lived in a Hungarian community in California. And she had lived there for a long time. She never learned English. She just spoke Hungarian. She didn't need to speak English She had people around her who spoke Hungarian. So when you would call, her to ask her something about my step grandmother, she could say hello on the phone and then she would hand it to somebody else. And to me, think about the power of that, right? That she's living in California, but the community sense and the fact that other people would be there for you were strong enough that of course, she could be also an amazingly stubborn woman. I didn't get to know her personally, but still, that's pretty remarkable. Oh, I see that we're like just about at the time here. Okay, so let me offer my end of episode comments here. That's right. Carolee says, an amazingly stubborn woman in Joanne's life. There are several in my family tree. So what's going to happen now is, for those of you who've been here before, that we segue directly from this episode to what we call the after party. What that means is that we stop recording and we can talk about whatever the heck we want to talk about. So it's more relaxed and more free flowing than this conversation might be, although we're pretty free flowing in this conversation, but still different kind of conversation. If you are watching this on Facebook and want to join the after party, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. And that will put you smack in the middle of the after party in about 2 minutes. In the meantime, I want to say to everyone what I always say every week. Thank you for coming, engaging in these conversations about politics, about democracy more than anything else, about what works and what doesn't, and what means that it survives and what things attack it. And certainly one of the things that's good for democracy is people getting together, asking questions, and having these kinds of conversations. So thank you for being here on a Friday and engaging in democracy. I hope everyone has a wonderful, wonderful week. It's true. I'm not going to say it. I didn't say one of my characteristic words, and I'm not going to say it because then people won't get bingo. But at any rate, I will continue chatting with some of you momentarily. For others, have a great week.
Thank you all so much from all of us here at NCHE. And thank you so much, Joanne, for being here every Friday. We'll see you at the after party.
Now, does the after